Thank you, everybody. Welcome. So I am a professor of psychology and cognitive science, and let me start out by telling you a little bit about why I do what I do. When you go to school, most of you at your age, you don't get much choice in what you're going to study. You have to study English and physics and all that stuff that they make you sit through. When you go to college, you get a bit more choice, and so you have some options about what you should study. And here, I think, is the best piece of advice I have ever seen by anyone about what you should spend your time studying when you get the choice. In any field, find the strangest and most fascinating thing, and then explore it. This is actually advice from a physicist about what to do in physics, but I think it applies across all of science. So if we were to follow this advice and we were to say, okay, what is the strangest and most fascinating thing in the entire world? I think that the answer is clear, and it is us. Now that doesn't actually narrow it down very much. You could study us in the context of poetry or archaeology or biology, and so we can keep going. We can say, okay, what is the strangest and most fascinating part of us? And again, I think the answer is clear. The strangest and most fascinating part of us is not our elbows, it is not our knees, it is our brains. And so I am a cognitive scientist, and what cognitive scientists study is basically the study of how the strangest and most fascinating thing in the world works. We study how the mind works. We study things like perception, language, reasoning, attention, morality, intelligence, all of these things that make us who we are, that give us our human nature. My background is actually kind of interesting in cognitive science. I started out in a different area of science. I was a computer scientist, and I was interested in what we call artificial intelligence, the study of how we can get computers to do human-like things. I eventually became much more interested in non-artificial intelligence, that is to say in human intelligence. And so now I study how the mind works, with a focus in particular on the first thing listed up here, perception. Now, what we have learned in cognitive science, if we've learned anything, is something that we sometimes call instinct blindness. Now, what does this mean? Instinct blindness is the idea that we take for granted, we underestimate so much of the magic of who and what we are because the brain makes so much of what we do seem so obvious and so natural. And nowhere is this more true than in the study of seeing. Seeing is something that you have done today thousands of times since you got up. But if you ask yourself, you have no idea how it works. If I ask you, for example, how do you recognize somebody's face? The only honest answer you can give is that you have no idea. It seems to occur beneath the surface. But what we've learned as scientists is several of the most seemingly magical, inspiring things that we do, like seeing the world in the first place, are exactly those sorts of things that are the hardest challenges that the brain faces. And so there's an incredible amount of interesting magic going on underneath the surface. And what we're going to talk about today is how some of that magic works. And I'll just comment by way of motivating our topic of seeing today. Here's a brain. This is where it all happens. All of your thinking and loving, it all happens in this couple pounds of meat. And you might be interested to learn that almost half of the brain is devoted just to helping us see the world in the first place. By the way, this is a brain that has been soaking in formaldehyde for a while. For those of you who aren't grossed out, if you want to see what a brain actually looks like when it's fresh, here you go. So we're going to be talking about what about half of this organ in our bodies is devoted to. Now, as I said, we typically take for granted perception. When I go to parties and I tell people that I study visual perception, people usually say, "Oh, what's the big deal?" They'll say, "Oh, so you study the eye." And I have to step back a little bit and say, well, not really. In fact, I know surprisingly little about how the eye itself works. But I think this is an important question because it tells us that we typically think of seeing as if it's just a simple matter like maybe what a camera does. But it turns out that what we see is not just a function, is not just a result of the light that enters the eyes, but it's a result of what happens in the brain on the basis of that light that enters in the eyes. And we can make this point to start out with pretty quickly already by focusing on some simple sort of aspect of what we see. So one of the things that we see is color. We see the world in color. And you might wonder, why? Why do we see the world in color? Well, presumably, there's something out there in the world. We would actually call it the different wavelengths of absorption and reflection of different objects. But we might say just there's something out there in the world that differs about different objects and how the light scatters off different objects, and that's what causes us to see color. But it turns out that the answer of how we see color is more interesting than that. So here's a little demonstration for you. This is kind of a strange washed out image, and there's a black dot right in the middle of it. So I'd like to ask you to stare at that black dot and don't move your eyes. Keep your eyes fixated right in that black dot, and I'm going to turn the lights off here for just a second. And in just a second, I am going to advance the slide to the next slide here, and there's going to be another picture on the screen. And that picture is going to have a black dot at the same point here. And what I'd like you to do is to, as soon as I go on to the next slide, I want you to keep staring at that black dot for 1 second. In other words, when the next slide comes up, don't move your eyes. Keep your eyes fixated right there, and keep staring at the dot for 1 second, and you can just notice what the image seems like. And after 1 second, I want you to close your eyes. You with me? All right, keep staring at that black dot. Okay, in just a second now, I'm going to advance the slide, stare at it for 1 second, and close your eyes. But don't move your eyes. Keep them at the black dot. Here we go. Okay, close your eyes. You might be surprised to learn that that second image that I showed you was completely in black and white. There was no color there whatsoever. Now this time I'll let you appreciate that. Let's do this again. Keep staring at that black dot. Keep staring at that black dot. And this time, why don't you do this? Oh, yeah, don't stare at that black dot. There we go. Keep staring at this black dot again for about maybe 15, 20 seconds. And again, I'm going to advance to the next slide. This time, why don't you keep staring at the black dot for just like half a second or 1 second, and then move your eyes to anywhere else in the image. Okay? So here we go. Keep your eyes on the black dot. All right. So already, we can start to see that there's something kind of interesting going on here. You want to do it one more time? Yeah, okay. All right, here we go. This only works if you keep your eyes really, really still, focused right at that center spot. All right, and here we go. So already, we can see that what's going on when we see the world, even when it comes to seeing a simple feature like color, is a little more interesting than we might have expected. The reason you saw color in this image is not because there's color in the image. It's a black and white image. But somehow what we did first was sort of fooling the brain into seeing that there's color. And so what this shows us is that the perception of the world, even the perception of something like the color of objects, is not just caused by the light that enters the eyes. It's caused by your brain. What's actually going on in this situation is that we have these colors that are affecting certain cells in your brain, certain types of photoreceptors that respond to different wavelengths of light, and they sort of push against each other. And so when you spend a long time looking at one color, like this blue here, in the same part of your visual field, it'll suddenly turn red. It wants to see red for a second. And that's what's going on here. We'll come back to this idea in a little bit. So the magic of perception is not the light that enters the eyes, it's what your brain does with that light. And we'll talk a little bit today about how this works. And we'll talk about two questions. The first question is, what do we see? And the second question is, how do we see? Let's start with this first one. What do we see? Well, this is a question that I think everyone has a very intuitive answer to. What do we see? We see whatever's right in front of our eyes. The answer, as we have discovered through doing some extremely surprising scientific experiments, the answer tells us that that idea that what we see is right in front, whatever is right in front of our eyes, is not true. What we see is much more surprising than that. So probably the biggest problem that the brain faces when trying to see the world is that there's way too much information going on out there to process at any one time. As a result, the brain has to focus on only a small bit of the light that enters the eyes at any given moment. And we're kind of familiar with this in other contexts. Who knows who this is? Who's that? Waldo. Okay, everyone has seen Where's Waldo? There's Waldo, and then in a typical Where's Waldo cartoon, you have to go find Waldo. And it's pretty hard. Now, Waldo, I'm telling you, is right in front of your eyes right now. But you don't see Waldo. Because even though Waldo is right in front of your eyes, you are not directing your attention. You're not paying attention to Waldo. There's also something really sort of mean going on in this image. What does Waldo look like? Waldo is like red. He's got a lot of red. He's got these stripes. Well, here, there's all sorts of red in the image. There's all sorts of stripes in the image. And so you could stare at this for many minutes before you see. Does anyone see Waldo yet? Oh, some people are Waldo experts here. Here we are. There's Waldo, right in the middle behind those two women. Now, the fact that Waldo has red stripes and that there's a lot of red and that there's a lot of stripes in this image is what makes Waldo hard to find. And we can see this in some even more simple displays. So we can do this experiment right here. I'd like to have everybody raise your hand. Just raise your arm up. And I'm going to give you a task here to find Waldo. But Waldo's pretty boring here. Waldo is just the red circle. So I'm going to show you an image, and as soon as you see the red circle, I want you to put your hand down on your desk so that everyone can hear you. Let's practice. 1, 2, 3. All right. And we're going to be able to hear how long it takes people to find this extremely boring Waldo. All right? So I want everyone, as soon as you can find the pink or the red circle here, put your hand down. All right? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Now that was boring. Okay, that was pretty simple. Let's try again. Find the red or the pink disc here. As soon as you find it, I want everyone to put your hand down again like that so everyone can hear. Here we go. All right. It just kind of jumps out at you. There's a lot of objects on the screen, but did you feel like you had to search around to try to find it? No, it just sort of jumped out at you. Why might that be? Why might that be in this image? What makes, oh, it's okay, you don't have to do it now. What makes that pink disc, do you suppose, easy to find in this image? Yeah, what do you think?
Because all the rest of them are white, except this one is red.
It's different than all the other ones, right? Unlike the Waldo case, it's totally different. It's the only pink one in the display, or it's the only circle in the display. Let's try again. This time, find the find the yellow disc. Everyone put your hand up, and as soon as you find the yellow disc, put your hand down so we can hear you. Here we go. That sounded a little different. Let's try again. This is even more complicated. You're looking for a little bar that is yellow and tilted to the left like that. As soon as you find it, put your hand down. All right. What's going on here? Well, this is, in this situation, what we just heard here from the front row is no longer true. There's no single feature that this particular Waldo shares that makes it unique in the display, right? It's not the only yellow thing. It's not the only left tilted thing. Or in this image, it wasn't the only circle. It wasn't the only yellow thing. This is what makes Waldo hard to find. when the thing that you're trying to attend to isn't going to jump out of the display at you. Now, attention. We're all familiar with attention. All of you who are in school have probably had people tell you to pay attention. Attention, we have learned, has three components. It has selectivity. Selectivity is the idea that even though the light that enters your eyes is all the same, you can pay attention, you can select some information but not others. It has a capacity limitation, which is just to say there's a limit on how good you can be at doing this. And there's a sense of effort involved. And let's try to take these and try to feel them. So here's another little task for you. And this is the kind of thing we do in our laboratory. We bring people into our laboratory and we have them do experiments like this to try to figure out how attention works. So here are a bunch of little discs on the screen, little white circles. And in just a second, one of them is going to blink. Oh, we have a question here. Yeah. What is what? You need to say that one more time.
One is blue.
One of them is blue. Oh, one of them is blue. Yes, that is completely right. That little thing in the middle is blue. I'm going to ask you to just completely ignore that. That one is not going to be interesting. As you'll see, the other circles are going to be a little more interesting here. In just a second, one of the other white circles is going to blink, and that one is your target. And even though you're going to have them all in front of you, they're all going to be entering your visual system. I want you to try to keep track of just the one that blinks. So at the end of the motion, it'll blink again, and you have to tell me if you managed to track it the entire time. You with me? All right, it's like a little simple, extremely boring video game. Let's try it. So there's your target. Try to keep track of it. How'd you do? Everyone get it? All right, that's way too easy. We already can see the sense of effort involved. Notice how the room got quiet here. Everyone had to do what? Had to pay attention. But let's try to see if we can get a sense of the capacity limitation and feel the effort a little bit more. That was obviously too easy for all of you. Let's try to keep track of 2. Notice that this becomes a little harder because now you can't just follow it around with your eyes. All right, let's try it. Oh, congratulations. Now, still, I saw some of you kind of cheating a little bit. I saw some people sort of going like this. Yeah, you can only really keep your eyes pointed at one, but you've got 2 fingers. Anyone have 3 hands? No? Okay, unless you want to bring your foot up and try to. Let's keep going. It seems like you guys are pretty good at this. Try to keep your attention focused on just 3 of these objects. All right, you guys are pretty good. Here we go. 4. Now you're starting to feel the effort involved in attention. You're starting to feel the sense of capacity limitation. All right. If you're doing it, we'll keep going. 5. I think we can hear from the giggles. We could hear from the giggles and the fact that strikingly fewer people raise their hands in victory. This is getting to be around the capacity limit of the human visual system. We have machinery in our brains that lets us keep track of 1, 2, 3, 4. Once you get to 5, pretty hard. For those couple who raised your hands, this is just for you. Okay, we've got some experts here. Here's an interesting little factoid for you. Most people find keeping your attention focused on 6 objects at the same time to be very difficult. But there has been a report that NBA basketball players, NHL hockey players are really quite good at this. They find it quite easy. Now, why are we talking about attention? Well, remember, does anyone remember way back from like 5 minutes ago, what is the question we're currently trying to ask? What is the question? What do we see? And we said we typically think that what we see is whatever is right in front of our eyes. But it turns out that's not true, because there's just too much information coming into the eyes at any given moment. The real answer that we've learned from doing this science is far more surprising. What we see is only what we're attending to at any given moment. Now, we can see this in some surprising ways. We can see this by looking at what we do and we don't notice based on what we're attending to. So, here is a simple example. This is another little game we can play, and the game is that I'm going to ask you to look at this image, and it's just a simple photograph of these 2 people having their lunch there. And I'm going to show you a picture, and then I'm going to change it, and I'm going to show you another picture. Okay? And between the change, there's going to be a little flash of a gray screen, and I'm just going to go back and forth, and you have to find what is changing. Okay? And to make this clear so everyone can see how we're doing, why doesn't everyone raise your hand? And as soon as you can tell what is changing in these pictures, put your hand down. You don't have to do it loud. We can just keep track of people's hands here. You ready? All right, let's try this. Let's see if this works. Well, that wasn't very good. Let's try that again. Nope. Let's try that one more time. There we go. Okay. So everyone put your hand up. And keep your hand up until you can see what's changing. Now, there's a big change between these 2 pictures. And it's right in front of your eyes. Not only is it right in front of your eyes, but you're trying to see it. And the change has occurred 20 times, 30 times already right in front of your eyes. If your hand is still up, take a look at the railing. Boom, 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 boom. Okay? Everyone can see this now. The railing is going up and down. And now that you see it, it seems so obvious. But was it obvious when you were first trying to find it? Except for a couple of you, it wasn't. Now, why couldn't you see this thing happening right in front of your eyes? Well, there are 2 things going on here that make it a little tricky. The first thing that's going on is you were not attending to that information. What was everyone looking at? The food, the faces, the people. No one was paying attention to the railing. And as a result, you completely failed to see what was going on there. The other thing that's going on that makes this work is also kind of interesting. Why are we putting that flash of a gray screen between each of the 2 images? Well, the reason is that if we didn't have that gray screen in between there, your attention would automatically jump to the railing as soon as it starts moving, because that movement would grab your attention. But we're not letting it grab your attention because we're making sure that everything changes at the same time by changing from that gray screen. Do you want to?
The gray is an optic color in that, or it just happens?
No, the gray is just a way of changing what's going on. So that at every moment when the railing changes, all of the pixels in that image are changing at the same time.
So you use the gray as an intermediate step rather than go.
Exactly. We use it as an intermediate step. So that's kind of surprising that you can't see that change. Do you want to try something like that again? Yeah? Okay, let's try one more. Let's try this one. All right, so same exact thing. Here's the first image. It's going to cycle back and forth between 2 images. Hands up. And keep your hands up until you can tell what's changing. Let me just say that the thing that's changing in this picture, it's kind of important. The reason it's kind of important is that you wouldn't want to ride on an airplane that didn't have an engine. Now again, once you see that that engine is coming and going, it's so obvious. But it's not obvious when you first try to look at it, because even though it was right in front of your eyes, you weren't paying attention to it. All right. Now, you might, at this point, stop and say, you know, that's kind of cool, but these are flickering pictures back and forth like this. When would something like this ever occur in the real world? And of course it wouldn't. But there are other situations in the real world where you might be blind to changes that are going on in front of you if you're not paying attention to them. Here's another interesting example of this. This one takes a while to load and so isn't going to change, but you can just look at it at first. Here's this nice city scene. And if you just look at this, at these people walking around, you can try to memorize what's going on in the image. And in a minute, I'll when I make it change, you can then try to find what's changing. Does that sound good to everyone? I just lied to you. The change already happened. The change happened while I was talking. Does everyone see that building right up there in the left? Let me put that slide up again. So what are we doing here? In this case, that building is coming onto the screen. But remember I said if something comes on suddenly, your eyes will automatically be pulled to it. Here we're just putting it on gradually enough so that you don't see it. But you still might say, you know what, yeah, okay, so that could maybe happen more than flickering in the real world, but how often do you go around walking around the world and things are slowly fading on and fading off? Well, the one thing you might say is, how would I know if they were? Since you wouldn't see it. Here's an interesting experiment that was run once upon a time. The researchers did this experiment to explore the real world implications of this kind of thing. And they ran this experiment on a college campus during a day when all the students were moving in. And so there were tons of people walking around carrying boxes and everything. And they stopped and asked, one of the experimenters stopped and asked someone for directions. And they did this over and over and over. And they were filming it as they did it, so you can see what happens. So here's this guy. His name is Leon, and he stopped this nice fellow and is just asking him for directions to the music building. And this other guy comes over to help, and he's pointing where the music building is. And something kind of rude is about to happen. These people who are carrying a door walk right between those two people. Did everyone see what happened there? The person that they ended up talking to is a completely different person. And what they did in this experiment is then they asked people, did you notice anything odd about the person you were just talking to? And a striking number of people completely failed to notice that the person they were talking to completely changed. So watch out. I'll show you one other example of this here. The researchers then moved to a different university, and they faced a problem, which is this new university said you're not allowed to run that experiment, because that experiment, when we run experiments as scientists, we have to tell people carefully what the experiment might involve. They have to sign a form that says I agree to participate in the experiment. And so the researchers thought, well, how could we do this? How can we make them sign a form if we're going to do this? And here's what they did. So there's one experimenter. There's another experimenter, completely different person. Kind of hard to see in this photo, but they're actually wearing different colored shirts and everything. And they set up in a university to run an experiment, and people walking by could sign up to be in a study. And as one of them was walking up, they would stand there. And so here comes this person, and we have the hidden plant camera here. And she's like, hi, I'll be in the experiment. And the person says, okay, can you sign this form saying you'll be in the experiment? And he says, okay, let me file this form, just a second. And the person who stood up and completed the discussion with her and told her to go down to the room at the end of the hall was a completely different person. And again, even in this situation, people completely failed to notice that the person talking to them was a completely different person. So the lesson here, by the way, at this point I should hold on just a second. No, I'm the same person. So the lesson here, what do we see? The answer is we don't see whatever's right in front of our eyes. We see whatever's right in front of our eyes that we pay attention to. If we're not paying attention to something, we're not necessarily going to see it. By the way, this is the kind of science that interacts with the real world in interesting ways. Kids, how many of you have seen your mom or dad or some other person who's not your mom and dad talk on their cell phone while they were driving in the car? Beyond being against the law, if you look at car accidents, for example, and you look at what causes car accidents, well, sometimes like someone stops really quickly or something like that. But the most common cause of really bad car accidents is, a motorcycle is in front of you, or there's another car, or there's a little girl crossing the street. And why do you hit the person? Because you didn't see them. That's what happens. In accidents, people say, well, why did you hit the person that was running across the road? I didn't see them. And you say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean you didn't see them? You were looking somewhere else? You were looking down at your feet or at the radio? And they say, no, I was looking right out the window, and I just didn't see them. Well, the thing is, when you're driving your car, especially if you're talking on your cell phone, you pay extra care to, for example, looking in your blind spot, looking in those regions that you know are going to be hard to see. But here's something you don't do. You don't spend extra time and effort to try to see whatever's right in front of you. Why? Because you assume that you'll see whatever's right in front of your eyes. But it turns out that we don't. So attention controls what we see, and don't talk on your cell phone while you're driving. Let's turn to another question. We've talked about what do we see. Let's talk about the question of how do we see. Well, we started out by saying that one of the most important things about perception is that there's too much information coming into the eyes to process. The second most important thing about perception is that there's not enough information coming into the eyes. What do we mean by this? There's not enough information, it turns out, for the brain to figure out the way that the world is outside that would have produced the pattern of light that hits our eyes. We scientists sometimes call this an inverse problem. Inverse just means the opposite. And what happens is, out there in the world, there could be all sorts of objects, and those objects, light scatters off those objects and ends up hitting the eye. But the problem is there are always multiple ways that the world could be that would cause exactly the same pattern of light to hit the eyes. And so if what we're trying to do when we see the world is try to figure out the way the world is, technically speaking, mathematically speaking, that is impossible. Whenever you have a little line in front of you, for example, suppose you see some little line. Well, what is that? It could be something very small that's very close to you, or it could be something big that's farther away from you. That might cast exactly the same pattern of light on your eyes. Furthermore, it doesn't even, if you see a little line in front of you, you don't even know the orientation of it. It could be sort of bent. It could be oriented in some different way. So vision, in this sense, is impossible. And we can see this in a couple of different ways. Here's a simple image, for example. This is not a computer-rendered image. This is just an image of an actual object. And can you recognize what that object is? A little toy ambulance or something like that, right? And how do you see that? Well, because it's got all this information that tells you what it is. It's got all this color and light that hits your eyes. Let's pick it up and take a look at it. Does everyone see what's really going on there? It is a little toy ambulance, but it's not what you think it is. It's a sort of hollow cutout of an ambulance. Okay? How many of you can even see it that way now? Probably a couple of you, but it's pretty hard. You want to see that again? All right, let's pick that up again. Why is it so hard to see what's going on at first? Well, because the light that hits your eyes from an actual little toy ambulance and the light that hits your eyes from this sort of deceptively constructed hollow concave toy ambulance is exactly the same. Here's another nice illustration of this. Sometimes you see these examples of a sidewalk art. So here is a painting that someone did on a sidewalk. And you can see, looking at it, that it's completely insane, right? You might not be able to see what it is yet, but there's something going on here, and then this is actually a woman's leg. It's her foot, and it's drawn all the way over here. And if you look at it, if you look at that piece of art on the sidewalk from most perspectives, it looks completely crazy like that. But if you stand in one certain spot, this is what it looks like. And now suddenly it looks like a really good piece of art. It sort of jumps out in 3D. And the reason is that if there were an actual woman taking a bath in the middle of the sidewalk, who was sticking her leg up in 3 dimensions, that would cast exactly the same pattern of light on your eyes as what's actually going on. So the brain has to try to figure this out. You might wonder, by the way, if this is impossible, you might wonder, wouldn't motion help? Because after all, if you're trying to figure out what this really is, well, you could just sort of start walking around to the side, and pretty soon you'll see that this is actually what's going on. So to help figure out whether motion helps, did everyone get one of these little things when they walked in, these little champagne wires? Can you raise your hand if you don't have one of these? Okay, so maybe if we've got any extras here, people could... oh, we're running out. Okay, so we'll have to share. This is a little... What this is actually the top thing that holds a cork on a bottle of champagne. So for you, we in the psychology department in the perception and cognition lab just drank 150 bottles of champagne last night so that we could try this. So I hope you appreciate this. I'd like to try something here. So what I'd like you to do is to, so first of all, note that you can hold this out and there's a little circle and there's a big circle. Right? Everyone see that? There's sort of a little circle at the top and there's a big circle. And to start out with, I would like you to hold it so that the little circle is closer to you than the big circle. And hold it out at arm's length and close your, for most of you, we're going to close your non-dominant eye, which if you don't know what that means, close your left eye. And make the 2 circles overlap a little bit. So make the little circle and the big circle overlap. And just with one eye closed, note what that looks like. Maybe put the little circle to the left of the big circle with the little circle closer to you so the 2 circles overlap, and you can just kind of see what that looks like. Okay? Now what I want you to do is turn it around so that the little circle is now farther away from you. Okay? Still hold it out at arm's length. Still keep one eye closed. Keep your left eye closed and have the 2 circles overlap. Try to make it look the same way it did before, so that the little circle is a little bit to the left of the big circle, but they overlap. And you can note that it makes it look the same way. But there's something else you can do here that's a little bit more exciting. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to hold it out with one eye closed, with the little circle farther away from you, overlapping the big circle. And I want you to just stare at it until you can see it as if the little circle is closer to you. How many of you can do that? All right. So when you get to that point, when even though it's farther away from you, you can see it as if it's closer to you, I want you to start ever so slowly twisting it back and forth. You can hear when this starts to work for people because they say, oh. How many of you notice something a little bit strange happening? All right, so guy in the sweater here, what is happening? What is happening when you start turning it? You turn it left, but it moves right. You turn it right, it moves left. How many of you are able to see this happen? Okay. If you can't see this happen, here is a gift for you. You can take this home and for the rest of the day keep playing with this. For those of you for whom this little demonstration is working, you might ask why. That seems completely crazy. When you move it left, actually if you're paying really close attention, you might notice that you're moving it left and it's moving to the right twice as fast as you're actually moving it. Why on earth would this be? For those of you for whom this isn't working, I've lost you for the rest of the lecture. You're going to be busy doing this until we get to the 3D glasses. The reason this works, the reason this is so surprising, is that it turns out that the pattern of light that hits your eyes from having the little circle close to you and moving to the left is exactly the same pattern of light that hits your eyes when the little circle is farther away from you and moving in the opposite direction twice as fast. And so the brain has to somehow figure out what's actually going on in the world and solve this impossible problem. By the way, does anyone know, why did I ask you to close one eye? Why do you think I asked you to close one eye? Yeah. Can you say that really loud? Okay, good. If you have two eyes open, you have extra information that you can use to try to figure out whether the little circle is closer or farther from you. And I want you to hold that thought, because we're going to come back to how that works in just a second. All right, vision is impossible, and what we see is a function not just of the light that hits the eyes, but what the brain interprets about what's going on. That's not just true of seeing in 3 dimensions, it's also true of something seemingly even simpler. So here's a quick, I don't think they told you there was going to be a test today, but here's the test. What color is that square? Black. All right. Now, that seems like a pretty easy test. But even that turns out to be a kind of surprising thing, that you see that as a black square. After all, let's just turn this off for a second. What color is this screen?
Gray.
Gray or white. And it looks gray or white. But now hold on. These machines up here are the projectors that shine these slides onto the screen, are machines that shine light onto a screen. And if the screen is white, you can't shine light onto a white screen and make it any darker. All you can do is make it lighter. So this thing that you see as black is the same thing that you're seeing as white right here. It turns out that even the perception of how light or dark something is, it isn't just a matter of the number of photons that hit your eye. It's a matter of what your brain decides is going on the basis of that. Here's a nice way to see this. Here's a little computer rendered image, and it's pretty straightforward. There's this sort of green cylinder on this checkerboard. Now, more test questions. Some of these squares look light and some of them look dark. And so if I say, for example, how bright, what kind of square is this one? White. What kind of square is this one? Black. So one of them is a light gray, one of them is a dark gray. And you might wonder, why? Why do you see that as light gray and dark gray? Well, presumably because it is light gray and dark gray. Hold the question for just a second. And you might be surprised to find out that those two squares are exactly the same. It's not true that one is light and one is dark. They're exactly the same. Now, it's kind of hard to see that, so let me help you. So focus on this square and this square. When I do this, normally people sometimes don't believe me. So let's see if we can help you out here by getting rid of the rest of the image. They're exactly the same. I hope you appreciate that, by the way. That only took me like 4 hours last night in the program to do all of that. So those two squares are exactly the same. Now you know that they're exactly the same. Let's bring the image back. Now they don't look the same. What is going on here? We'll come back to this in just a second. So how do we see? The way that we see is not just by operating like a camera. The brain, it turns out, does not get enough information to determine what's going on out there in the world. And so your brain basically has to be like a detective. Your brain is like Sherlock Holmes. It's taking the light that comes into the eyes and it's trying to figure out what is going on out there in the world. Now, this is the most complicated, boring slide in our talk today. And I'll try to make it a little simpler. How do we see? This is the answer to how we see. The brain makes heuristic assumptions about the world and causes us to see the world that was most likely to have produced the light that hits our eyes. All right, let's break this down. A heuristic. Does anyone know the term heuristic? A heuristic is like a rule, but it's like a rule of thumb. It's an assumption that you might make, that your brain might make in this case, about what's going on that doesn't always have to be true, but it's going to be true usually and is kind of a quick, helpful way to figure out what's going on. And so the reason, for example, that you see this as light and this is dark is because of the operation of a heuristic rule. It's an assumption that your brain is making. What is that assumption? Well, there are two types of changes between light and dark in this image. One of them is are these sort of sudden changes between light and dark. But there's another thing going on here that you may not have you might not have noticed, but your brain definitely noticed it. And that's that this cylinder is casting a shadow. Does everyone see the shadow? It's kind of a fuzzy change between light and dark. So this is a little bit lighter than there. This is a little bit lighter than there. Well, what your brain is trying to do when you see light and dark is to not count the light that's sitting there. You want to see what the world is actually like and not just what the sort of ambient lighting in the room is. And so your brain has a heuristic. Your brain has a little rule. And that rule says that things that are in shadow are actually a little bit lighter than they would appear to me, than the light that's going to hit the eyes. And things that are not in shadow are maybe a little bit darker than things that would be in a shadow. And so this square that looks light is inside the shadow. What about this square? It's outside the shadow. Your brain is being a detective. And so your brain, as soon as you see this image, says, you know what? I'm getting the same number of photons from those two squares, but one of them is a little bright, one of them is in a shadow. And so I think that one is actually probably a little lighter than the number of photons that hit my eye would suggest. And so I'm just going to amp this up, and what you see is the result. You see one look lighter because of that. Here's another little heuristic assumption that's kind of surprising. This is something that wait until Halloween time and you could do this by yourself. So here's a little example of a mask. Faces, it turns out, are really important to your brain. It's very important to see other people's faces, to sort of understand what other people are thinking, how they're attending. As a result, your brain likes to see faces in all sorts of situations. For example, even in situations where you might know that there really aren't any faces. As soon as you see this, you can tell what all of these fruits and vegetables are thinking and feeling, and etc. You can tell what's going on in an image like this. Sometimes you might encounter the fact that your brain likes to see faces even in places where there aren't really any faces. We seem to have a hair trigger on seeing something like faces. But seeing faces is still hard. Why? Because, well, there's just not enough information out in the world to figure out what's going on. Your brain makes an assumption. And here's the assumption that it makes. The assumption is that if it sees something that seems like a face, that object is probably convex. That is to say, it sort of sticks out, as opposed to being concave. Now, when would you ever see a concave face? When you're looking at the inside of a hollow mask. If you look at the inside of a hollow mask, it can look a little strange. Let's do it. This is an old school little movie here, and it's just a little Halloween mask. Here, we'll listen to this. This is kind of good.
This is the inside of a mask. Even when it's obvious what really is there, you still find it hard to believe, and you still perceive the inside as if it were the outside.
Your brain refuses to see the inside of a hollow mask as the inside of a mask. It wants you to see it as a face that's sticking out because it has this heuristic assumption wired into it. The other part of that complicated answer to how we see is that we see what the brain thinks is most likely to have produced the light that hits our eyes. Let's try to see a simple example of this, and then we'll have one more demonstration to end with. So let's start just simply here. If you see these two little lines, you see it as an angle. But of course, it doesn't have to really be an angle. It could be two completely unconnected lines that just happen to line up. Right? It could be like this, and you're just looking at them so that they're not actually touching, but they just happen to be ending at the same point. But think now, suppose these two lines are matchsticks, and suppose you threw two matchsticks up in the air. How likely is it going to be that they would end up perfectly touching? Very unlikely. How likely is it going to be that they would not end up touching perfectly with their points together? Very likely. So basically what that means is if they're not the same thing, then the fact that they would be connected at that line is just a coincidence. But your brain refuses to accept the possibility that what's going on there is a coincidence, and so it forces you to see that as two lines that are connected. Let's make this a little more complicated. When you look at this, you see these four Pac-Men. Do you guys still know what a Pac-Man is? Pac-Man? Okay, thank goodness. All right, I'm not old yet. Here we have four Pac-Men that are sort of arranged just in a willy-nilly order. Here are four Pac-Men, but do you see just four Pac-Men there, or do you see something else? What do you see? You see a white square. That is not true. That is an illusion that your brain is painting for you. There is no white square there. Here's another example. Here are three Pac-Men and three little triangles. Three little black triangles. But what do you see? You see a big white triangle. That white triangle is not there. It is an invention of your brain. Why is your brain inventing a white triangle? Well, because there are two possibilities. One possibility is that these are really three black circles and some connected lines, and that there's a white triangle sitting on top of them. The other possibility is what's really going on here, that there is no white triangle, but there are sort of three Pac-Men in these lines that just happen to be perfectly aligned. But remember what we said. If they just happen to be perfectly aligned and there is no triangle there, that would be a coincidence. Your brain refuses to accept the possibility of a coincidence, and so it forces you to see that white triangle. In fact, how many of you see a little bit of a difference between this shade of white and that shade of white? It's not there. That is an illusion that your brain is painting for you to help you see that white triangle that it has decided was there. It sort of paints it for you in a slightly different color. All right, I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to talk about how this works, coming back to this idea of seeing in three dimensions. So this is the last thing we're going to do today. And we're going to talk about one of the biggest challenges of perception, which is one of the challenges we started with. How do you see in three dimensions? The world in front of you is three-dimensional, but the light-sensitive part of your eye, it turns out, is only two-dimensional. So you just get like a drawing or a picture of what's going on in the world, and the brain has to somehow infer three dimensions. Now, does everyone remember when we were holding this out, I asked you to close one eye? Now I'm going to tell you why I had you close one eye. One of the tricks, one of the many different tricks that the brain uses to help us see in three dimensions is something called stereo vision. And stereo vision capitalizes on the interesting fact that we don't just have one eye. We have two eyes. And our two eyes are pretty close, and so what you see out of your left eye and what you see out of your right eye is basically the same thing. But there are some subtle differences. And it turns out those subtle differences are really important. So let's do this for a second. Hold up your finger in front of your nose and put it really close to your nose. And now close your left eye, and now close your right eye. And ask yourself, how far is your finger moving, say on the screen here on the background? Okay? Now, do the same thing, but hold your finger out as far as you can in front of you. And now close your left eye. And now close your right eye. And ask yourself, how far is your finger moving when you do that on the background? Is it moving more or less when your finger is farther away from you? Less. Does everyone see that? If you move your finger really close to you, your finger is like moving across the whole room. If you hold your finger way out in front of you, it's only moving a little bit. It has to do something tricky. It has to show your right eye and your left eye something a little different. So, by the way, there's another way you can do this. Do you guys still ever see these things? These stereoscopes or Viewmasters? I guess you can still buy one that has Harry Potter on it these days. All right. So, here we have something. No. Don't take those glasses off. Here we have some simple shapes on a screen, and there are blue lines and there are red lines. And in each case, there are some blue lines and red lines. Now, in a second, what you're going to do is you're going to look at this with your special glasses. And one of the lenses of the glasses is red and one of the glasses is blue. So basically, this is just a really cheap way to help you see the left. One eye will see the red and one eye will see the blue because these lenses will filter it out. Now, if you take the glasses off for a second, let's look, for example, and let's look at this. Let's look at this image right here, and let's ask ourselves: take this vertex right here, this little point. Is the blue and the red really close to each other, or are they really different from each other? They're really close, right? That blue point and that red point are almost exactly the same. What about down here? Is that more or less of a difference? More. And what about right here? A lot more. So if your brain is a good detective, your brain should be able, just like when you were holding your finger out in front of you like this, you should be able to put your glasses on and see this in 3 dimensions. And for how many of you does this work here? So if this jumps out for you in 3D, you should be able to see this vertex is closer to you, this vertex is farther from you, and this vertex in the middle. Is this working for people? Yeah. All right. This is how you see in 3 dimensions. This is how a 3D movie works. But this is what your brain is doing all the time whenever your eyes are open, to let you see in 3 dimensions. And you can do some pretty cool things with even simple 3D glasses like this. For example, take off the glasses for a second. Here is just a simple picture of an eye, but it's been constructed carefully so that your eyes would see slightly different things. Put the glasses on. Looks a little better suddenly, doesn't it? It looks like it's in 3 dimensions. It turns out that other scientists even use this technique, for example. So here, for example, is a microscope picture of the surface of a piece of paper. And it turns out that if you look close enough, even the surface of a piece of paper has all sorts of canyons and valleys and ridges and mountains. And it's hard to see that, though. But if you make an image that has the left and right eyes slightly different, how many of you can see this as if it's like popping out in depth? All right. So there you go. Your brain is like a detective. Oh, one more thing. If your brain is trying to put the left eye and the right eye together and is being a detective and is doing all this like subtle math about how far apart is this between your left eye and your right eye, you might wonder, what is your brain going to do if the left eye and the right eye see something that's not just a little bit different, but see something that's totally different? Let's find out. Everyone want to put on your glasses? I'm going to show you a blue image and a red image, but they're going to be completely different. And you can just tell me, what do you see? Close your left eye. Now close your right eye. Now keep both of your eyes open at the same time. Here is an example of your brain not being able to make up its mind. Someone raise your hand and tell me, what did you see when your eyes were open? What did you see?
I saw Yoda and Darth Vader. Darth Vader was on the red one, and Yoda was on the blue.
And did you see them both at the same time?
Yeah.
How many of you sometimes saw only one of them? And then what happened? Did it stay always like that one? It suddenly switches. It suddenly switches. Here's a case where your brain is trying to put these 2 images together to figure out what's going on in depth, and it just fails. And so you see what's in front of one eye, and then you see what's in front of the other eye, and your brain can't make up its mind. All right. So what we've seen here is what we see in the first place is not just what's in front of our eyes, but it's something much more surprising than that. It's only what we attend to. And how do we see? How we see is the brain has to make all sorts of detective-like inferences to figure out what's going on in the world in the first place. And I'll just end with one sort of extra demonstration here. Sometimes the inference that your brain can make is that an object out there that has light that's hitting your eyes isn't even there in the first place. Sometimes what your brain decides is that it's not there. So let me tell you one other interesting fact about your eyes. I said I didn't know much about the eyes, but I'll tell you one thing about the eyes. The light-sensitive part of your eyes, the part of your eyes that accepts the light and transduces that into energy which goes into your brain, is not on the front of your eyeball. It's in the very back of your eyeball. That's kind of a weird engineering solution. That means there's all sorts of stuff in between the world and the light-sensitive part of your eye, what we call the retina. The question is, why don't you see that stuff? There are blood vessels, for example, that run along the surface of your eyeball. Why don't you see those blood vessels? Why don't you see the shadows from the blood vessels? The reason is they don't move relative to what's going on in the rest of the visual field, and as a result, your brain decides that it's not there and it erases it from view. And we can see another example of this. So everyone, this will be the last slide here. Everyone take a look at this without your 3D glasses, please. And there are 3 things in this image. There's a bunch of blue crosses. There's these 2 little white circles, and then there's this bright yellow disk. Okay? Now what I'd like you to do, in just a second, I'm going to make these blue crosses move. And I would like you to keep your eyes, just like we did this at the beginning with the example of color. I would like you to keep your eyes fixed on those white circles and do not move them. It's going to be hard to do this, but you need to try to really not move your eyes and keep them aimed right at those 2 white circles. And then I want you to notice what we're going to do with the yellow disk. All right, let's try this. Keep your eyes fixed right in the middle of those 2 white circles. And the blue crosses are moving. And what are we doing with the yellow disk? We're occasionally taking it away and bringing it back. Except that we're not. It's disappearing not from the screen, it's disappearing from your mind. And we can have you see this by, let's do this again, but this time, wait until it disappears. Keep your eyes fixed right at those 2 little white circles. Wait until it disappears, and as soon as it disappears, just move your eyes a little bit to anywhere else in the image and see what happens to the yellow dot. Okay? It disappears, but then what happens as soon as you move your eyes? It jumps back. It jumps back. And why is that? Because your brain, remember, what we see is not just what's in front of our eyes. What we see is what the brain, in its detective-like way, decides is in front of us. Your brain is deciding that it's not there. Your brain is basically saying, you know what? What's going on here? Here's a little spot that's not playing along with the rest of the visual field and that's staying perfectly fixed relative to my eye. Your brain decides that it's not there and it erases it from your visual awareness until you move your eye, and then your brain says, oops, I guess that's out there in the world in the first place because it's moving now relative to my eye, and it jumps back into your awareness. So what we see is a much more fascinating, scientific, complicated matter than what we would typically take completely for granted. So for the rest of today, as you walk around seeing things, try not to take it for granted so much, and be aware that what we see is not just a simple function of your eye acting like a camera, but it's your brain doing some amazing things. Thank you, everybody.